Hey guys, still getting settled in. Give me a sec. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. Wanted to make sure I had it set up right. How's everyone doing tonight? Have a good start to your week? Sounds questionable. Maybe it's just the notion of eggplant. Got a couple more minutes before we get underway here. Well, since the new version broke save game compatibility, and I haven't gone through and found an equivalent for my version 31 tutorial seed. We're still in the process of finding a suitable embark. I don't know, man. Not sure eggplant's dinner. But I figure now that version 40.05 hopefully is at least a save game stable version, I'll start digging for a tutorial save when we finally get DF hack. I'll have to go back and review the stuff that we've done before that. So we'll have to go back and redo this fortress basically. But we can go ahead and get started on something. We'll figure out what we'll get once we actually get a world generated. Tonight I'll be covering the most basic sorts of things about Dwarf Fortress, getting it, setting it up, how the utilities work. We probably will get through actually embarking tonight. So this would be everything you need to know in order to actually get started playing Dwarf Fortress. We'll cover some topics that are not necessary for a new player to actually know on day one, but are things that you're going to want to know in general about the product you're downloading, the item you're playing, how to set it up, how to configure it, things like that. So if you want to tweak it later on to your personal liking, you'll know how to go about it. We've had 20 plus a few times along the way. Now, if you're here, chances are pretty good that you saw the Dwarf Fortress subreddit thread where I talk about how to get, or what we're going to do tonight. And if you have, the sidebar on that actually has the a link to the starter pack. So if you're out here in the Dwarf Fortress subreddit, on the sidebar over here, you're going to see Paradex's Errants DF Starter Pack, and that'll take you off to Bay 12, and Bay 12 will allow you to get it and download it. Right here, the main download page on Dwarf Fortress Depository. You'll go over there and, hey, look, there's your download link, and it'll even let you know what version you're running. Tonight we're going to be using version 40.05 of Dwarf Fortress. The starter pack is release 1. Later versions will probably be, for the most part, identical to this one. If there's any major changes, you can count on me to go back and at some point do another tutorial to cover what's changed. But the big one, this looks like we've gotten past most of the save game corruption and instability issues. Kind of moved on to the bug fixing phase when things are stable but not necessarily unchanging. Once you've downloaded Dwarf Fortress, I'll click over here to my folder. Extract it and go into that folder, and you'll find the starter pack launcher, and that's what you'll start up to actually get into all of the additional features that we're talking about tonight. Now, underneath this are several folders that are of interest to a new player. User-generated content is for things that you create for yourself that you want to be able to port forward in later versions of the starter pack. LNP contains all of the utilities that we'll discuss along the way. The Dwarf Fortress folder itself is basically a copy of what you would get with the vanilla Dwarf Fortress install. You can in fact just double-click Dwarf Fortress and start it up by itself right now without having to make any further changes. Now, underneath that are several folders that I do want to talk about in brief. The raw folder contains the details and descriptions and makeup of everything in your world. So this is everything that exists in Dwarf Fortress. Every item, every material, every little piece of everything is in this particular folder. We'll be going out and touching some of this indirectly just so that you know what you're doing and what you're looking at. In particular, I'll actually disable aquifers because I don't really fancy a new player learning how to pierce aquifers on day one, and they're kind of an annoying thing to work around if you don't actually intend to use them. So we'll disable aquifers before we get started, and we'll be playing with a modified version of Dwarf Fortress. In fact, you'll notice that that's one of the more common features to disable because there's actually a push button right here to do the same thing in the starter kit launcher specifically for that. A lot of players don't like dealing with aquifers. It restricts the kind of sites you can embark in, and unless you're planning to use them for purposes of infinite power or infinite water supplies, they're not particularly useful to gameplay. They're just an obstruction to actually getting into building a fortress. If you really want to play the vanilla game, you can start with aquifers. You can find sites that don't have them. It's very simple to look for areas that don't have an aquifer and embark, but you're not guaranteed to find all the combination of features you want and avoid an aquifer at the same time. Along the way, we'll touch on what some of these things actually represent. In particular, we'll touch on the inorganic materials because we'll be modifying some of them to get rid of the aquifers. Further modifications I've done in the past as demonstrations are to go into the soil raw and change it so that all the clays and the sands are the same soil for purposes of a tutorial. Yeah, I have to go through all the settings. I've just downloaded version R1, so we'll be going through everything along the way as I get it kind of set up the way I like it. Basically, the raws are just text files, and all they contain is just tags, and these tags describe everything in the world. So this is the inorganic material clay, And it tells you that it's a soil and various things about it. We won't go into depth in all of this. And it tells you that it can be used to make clay, earthenware, which is basically pottery. Um, all of these files are similar. If I go into the creature, let's see, creature reptiles, why not? Here's a description of a lizard. If I go on down, there may be descriptions of other things, cast modifiers, and everything about lizards that you could ever possibly want to know, pretty much. The plant raws contain the information on all the different plants in the world. We'll talk about plump helmets in particular, and here's the raw for plump helmets. Descriptions on how they're all used and everything. What reactions they can be used. The raws define everything in Dwarf Fortress. Literally. So modifying them or changing them means you're changing your game, how it plays. So in particular, I'll try to call out when I've made a change that's going to modify something from the vanilla experience, if you will, to allow you to determine for yourself whether you want to do it and follow along or simply skip it and recognize what that may mean for your fortress. Now, as we go through, population cap will determine how many dwarves your fortress will be allowed to hold. 200 is a fairly large number. You don't have to have a large cap. Small caps will limit your fortress to that number of dwarves. If you limit it enough, that will actually restrict some of the features that Dwarf Fortress has because they're only available to larger fortresses. We should be able to run a fortress of 200 dwarves. It's when it starts to get above 200, it starts to get noticeably laggier. You'll have to be a little more conscious of how many dwarves you have and how much space you dig out and so forth. And we'll touch on frame rate issues a little bit as we go on. For right now, I'm going to leave that untouched. We won't hit it tonight in any case. Invaders are whether goblins and undead and necromancers and other bad things can come and visit your fort. If you're looking to experience a very peaceful game, you can turn that off, and basically your fortress will be played a little more like SimCity and a little less like a tower defense game, if you will. Whether you play with that or not, that's up to you. We'll be leaving it on for tonight because we're actually going to prepare and play this fortress as though it's relatively stock. Temperature determines things like whether things will melt if you throw them into lava, whether water will freeze, and things like that. It has a frame rate effect. Turning temperature on does have impacts for your frame rate, and you can improve your frame rate by turning it off. But if you want to see the game behaving realistically, you're going to want to leave it on. Entomb Pets is a setting that will touch manually in the init files. Determines whether cats and dogs and emus will get buried in your tombs by default, and we'll turn that off because I normally don't bury pets unless they've done something very special. Child cap determines whether your fortress will have pregnancies. We'll leave it at default for now. Cave-ins determines whether unsupported sections of the ceilings and floors will collapse under their own weight. That's basically gravity for all intents and purposes, and there's no real reason to leave it off. Unless you're wanting to do something incredibly absurd and don't want to risk having it collapse. So if you want to build a floating fortress for your dwarves, cave-ins off will allow you to do that. Weather was things like rain and snow. We leave those on. Artifacts are whether your dwarves will get moods. Starting labors determines what labors dwarves will be allowed to do by default when they come to your fortress. We'll discuss labors and how to set them a little later when we get into Dwarf Therapist. Liquid depth I want on because I want to know how deep the water is. The depth of water has an effect on dwarves as they wade through short streams, and they won't enter deep water manually for themselves normally. Varied ground is just a graphic option. Aquifers will turn off here, and I'll explain what we've done with that. This is modifying your game from vanilla somewhat in that the world will no longer create aquifers. Depending on what area we embark in, it's possible that if you're following along with aquifers on, you may have an obstacle that I don't touch. I don't feel that aquifers really add anything for new players. I think that's much more of a feature for an advanced player. If you want to have a vanilla experience, turn that on. Otherwise, if you're following along, that's where we'll go. Settings-wise, as always, I use the Phoebus tile set, so we'll get some of this stuff here. Let's see, intro movie we'll leave off, windowed on. I like to back up my saves so that if something goes wrong, I have backup copies. This will allow you, if you desire, to go back to various points in your fortress historically. So, for example, if I wanted to go to the second spring of my fortress, there'll be a save game for that because I'm doing seasonal saves and I'm backing it up. So every save will be written to its own separate subfolder. You can use that if something goes terribly wrong. You collapse your fortress and it pancakes the entire thing, and you kind of want to keep playing that fortress. You can load up the backup save and go from there. Initial save is whether you get a save as soon as you arrive on site. I like pausing on load so that a game doesn't start if I walk away from it while it's loading. There's no reason to turn compressed saves off unless we have a terrible corruption issue of some sort. We'll turn this up. Dwarf Fortress is a single core process. It does not get any benefit whatsoever from being run on modern uh, multi-core processors, so there's no reason to. I mean, unless you have an overclocked single core, you're basically going to get Dwarf Fortress running on one core by itself, and your other cores remaining for operating system and other processes. Don't turn it up to real time. That has potentially other effects. High is sufficient. If you find that Dwarf Fortress, if you're running on a single core process and Dwarf Fortress is causing things to be too impacted elsewhere, you can turn this down. Normal is default. Idle basically means the program doesn't run, and real time means it pretty much gets as much resources as it likes. Graphics will set up Phoebus. I have to bounce back over here because I think that probably changed a couple things back here. I want to make sure that nothing has changed. Okay, good. Perfect. Utilities, we'll be discussing Dwarf Therapist for labor setting. We'll be discussing Quick Fort for designating areas that will dig out manual or automatically, basically from our blueprint. We'll use Sound Sense for sound effects. We won't be cracking our world in Legends tonight. I'll briefly touch on the Legends game mode, but I won't actually do much with it. We are going to edit our init files, and let's talk about it before I actually get into that. Let's talk about what the init files actually are. Under the data folder is where your save games are stored, and where certain files that control Dwarf Fortress general behavior are stored. In particular, we'll be touching on init, dinit, and announcements tonight. I'll discuss World Gen, but we won't be making any changes to that one. If you open these up, these are just text files just like the RAWs, and you can make modifications to them. For example, if I want to turn the sound volume off, I can turn it to 0 right here, and this will turn sound off for Dwarf Fortress. I can disable the sound itself up here, or I can change the volume down here. Each one of these items in brackets is called a tag. Make sure that for your tags you don't leave them half exposed like this. That won't have a good effect. Or that you don't delete them on both sides, because that will cause Dwarf Fortress to basically ignore the contents. All tags need to have their opening and closing brackets. Let's see. Print mode, we'll change that to standard. If you have modern graphics hardware of any sort, you probably can run standard and not have any problems. 2D is purportedly the most stable. I've never actually had a problem running standard whatsoever. And according to the last documentation Toady provided us, standard should be a little faster. I haven't tinkered with the other modes. You're welcome to do so. Let's see. We want a frame rate counter. We'll leave all this as it is. You'll notice right here is priority. That corresponds directly to this setting in the starter pack. So right here where it says processor priority high, that's this setting. We can change it manually ourselves, and we're not going to change it from what it is because I configured it the other way around, but you can change everything that we're changing from the starter kit push buttons manually in these files, either in inits or in the RAWs. Compressed saves, if we want our saves to be compressed, that's the same setting that was in the push buttons in the other setting. Some things are available in here that aren't necessarily available in the tool set. In particular, things like your graphics mode. Make sure you save the file as a text file. If you're opening this with Word, you could save it as a doc file, and that will just not do you any damn good whatsoever. So open it with Notepad or WordPad and make sure you save it as a text file. Oops, didn't mean to close that folder. All right. dinit controls behavior for some Dwarf Fortress functions pertaining to Fortress mode. So here's the temperature, weather, etc., all these different features. Tile descriptions, all sorts of things you probably won't touch. There are a few things I do like to tinker with. Let's see, I don't see the one I was looking for in here. Ah, there it is. Log map rejects. I turned this on, and the reason I'll discuss with you guys later is that we'll use this to determine potentially why our world generation is failing so that we know why our worlds aren't being created. If you are not tinkering with the advanced world gen settings, this does nothing for you. If you are, then this will help you debug the process as you go along. Does 2D async improve? Because I haven't really tinkered with the graphics modes, to be honest. It's one of those things I set and forget. I've just put it on standard all along. And let's see, idler's top is fine. There are settings for pertaining, for example, just to adventure mode, for example, how nicknames work, legends mode. We'll discuss game modes here in a bit. Now, once we've made our changes there, we'll save those. Both the init and the dinit file have been modified slightly. These are just configuration settings. There's no real settings menu. There's a settings menu in Dwarf Fortress, but it doesn't cover all these things. Announcements pertains to things that your dwarves will announce as they happen. Events will cause messages to be sent to log files, text boxes to pop up on screen, thing like that. In particular, the only ones we'll actually be touching in here are ones that get really annoying if you have to work around them repeatedly. When your dwarves dig out stone that's adjacent to rivers, for example, or aquifer tiles, that tile will be marked as damp. And by default, the game will pause every time it happens. And the problem you'll do is you'll designate a whole big area, and your dwarves will come along, and they'll dig one tile out, and they'll find some damp stone, and they'll pause the game. And they'll recenter the screen wherever it happened. And you knew it was there because you told them to do it, and you intended for them to do it, because you know it's safe. And you'll redesignate the new area, and you'll move your screen away, and the dwarf will dig out the next tile over, and hey, look, that one's damp too, and the game will pause, and it'll recenter, and it's really annoying. So I turn it off. Now, I do want to get the you can't turn off the actual job cancellations, and all we're going to do here, these tags pertain to the actual behavior that will occur. So dig cancel damp corresponds to the I found wet stone event, and this determines whether you see it in adventure or in dwarf mode, whether the game will pause or recenter, and all I do is remove the pause and the recenter from both the damp and the warm. Warm pertains to digging stone near magma, and damp pertains to digging it near water. Now, you are removing a slight safety feature here, because your dwarves won't jerk your attention away and point at the wet stone if you didn't already know about it. But if you go back and you check on a digging designation and they've canceled the area, and you go back to dig it and it's damp, that's a good sign that you need to be aware of there's water in the area. If you dig it and it's warm, you need to be aware that there's magma in the area. If you don't already know where it is, then it's time you need to find out before you dig and flood your fortress with one or the other. But I don't want it to constantly pause my game and recenter my viewpoint when I already know about the damp or the warmth. So I changed those so that they don't interrupt my game. Save that and close it. WorldGen is the file that contains all of the information pertaining to the settings that you'll use when you generate a world. We'll touch on this a little more here in just a moment. Now, we've changed all of those settings. We've saved all of those files. We go back into the starter kit. You can see I've got the utilities that I want running to come up automatically. We'll hit play Dwarf Fortress, and Dwarf Fortress will start. And I'll clear away some windows here, maximize and minimize a bunch of things. Bear with me. All I'm doing is getting Dwarf Fortress to the front. Oh, and see here, QuickFort's warning us that there's a default setting that interferes with QuickFort, and I do want QuickFort to change it, so we'll quit Dwarf Fortress real quick. And I'll go ahead and close these out while we're at it. And we'll hit yes, and it will go ahead and set that for me. If you hit no, you can set it yourself. Hit cancel, it will just leave it at default and never ask. I want it to be changed because it does actually impact QuickFort's performance. Okay, we have to do it ourselves. See, there's our log map rejects. Graphics mode, so we're in good shape. Keep in mind I didn't hit save. Okay, let's go ahead and look for that macro. We'll set macro ms to a reasonable value. Now, changing that could conceivably cause your macros to behave wrong. Basically, they'll skip steps and not work correctly. If you find as you're going along that your macros, if you ever get to that point, are behaving improperly and you've set this to 0, you might want to tweak it back up towards the default. Basically, all that's going to do is control how fast macro instructions attempt to execute. And if Dwarf Fortress is running a little slowly, I don't know what the result would necessarily be. Okay, there at the back is the window for Dwarf Fortress, hidden behind all of those fancy applications we're going to get to in a minute here. The game itself is, you can go ahead and create a new world from the get-go, just hit enter and off you'll go. You'll get a new world completely random. We'll actually be designing a world with advanced parameters, and despite the description, it's really not all that complicated. We'll be doing that because we want to kind of influence the terrain types that we're going to see in our world. That'll kind of give us a little bit of control over what sort of world we end up with. I'll discuss kind of in brief how what settings will change to affect what in your world. I'll explain how those things interact in general. There's a great deal of information, more than what I'll actually be able to cover in a tutorial, even if I hit every item in the menus. I encourage players who have questions when I'm not around to go ahead and check the Dwarf Fortress wiki. You can Google for Dwarf Fortress wiki, and I'm sure you'll find the only wiki you ever want to use for Dwarf Fortress. That'll have all sorts of information that we'll touch on tonight, as well as information that I may not get to tonight, or that you may experience differently in your fort. Now, as far as the utilities that we started up, let's talk about what we got here. The first one we'll talk about is SoundSense. SoundSense is basically an engine that runs in the background and reads Dwarf Fortress's game log and spits out sound effects. So this is basically combat noises and animals growing up and party noises when our dwarves throw party. Um, this will allow us to hear what's going on. Now, it's not strictly speaking vanilla, but it's really, really nice if you've played any game in the modern era and you're used to listening to sound effects for events. SoundSense provides sound cues for those events. Now, they are displayed in text. There's an announcement screen you can look at constantly and obsessively, and you can track it to monitor all of your uh, comings and goings in your fortress. But it's a little easier, particularly early on when you're unfamiliar with the game, to kind of associate those things to a sound effect that will occur whether or not you're looking at the announcements themselves. Now, when you first download the starter pack, there aren't actually any sounds. There are a few, but not many. And what you'll want to do is go in and download the pack update. And just click Start Update with the replace on, and it'll go ahead and download all the sounds and configure itself, and then tell you to restart it. And restarting SoundSense will allow it then to track your game and play those sound effects. Now, I've ported my sounds forward from a prior version, so we don't have to go through the lengthy download process tonight. But that will let you basically listen to the sounds of your fort as you play. Oh, did they? See, I didn't know that they'd added stuff that they hadn't put in the pack update. That's just a few days ago. I'm going to have to go out and get it. Going to have to go out and pick it up. We won't mess with it tonight. The second thing that we'll actually discuss. I went closed SoundSense. That was clever. The next thing we'll talk about tonight is Dwarf Therapist, and I'll get into this in depth and a great deal early on. But basically, this gives you a spreadsheet kind of view over what jobs can be performed in your fortress and who can do them. Awesome. That means I definitely got to get it updated. Perfect. All right. This basically will allow us to change what jobs our dwarves are doing on the fly. We'll use this heavily for controlling the behavior of our dwarves, and we'll come back to it over and over and over again as I tell dwarves to do various jobs, basically. And those utilities, SoundSense and Dwarf Therapist, are pretty much the only ones we're going to have to start. DF Hack hasn't updated yet, so we won't be able to touch on it tonight. Typically, I will use DF Hack to help me find a site I want to embark on. I'll be using it to automate various mundane fortress tasks that I don't want to have to obsessively micromanage. But it's possible to play Dwarf Fortress without it, and 40.05 looks to be a reasonably stable version. DF Hack is coming shortly. This looks like a good time to pick up with the new version. All right, so here we are in Dwarf Fortress. We'll go ahead and object test. I should cover what each of these is. Create new world will just create a random world for you from scratch without you changing anything other than in the most general terms. Skip past the attribution here. World size is how big your world will be, how long your history will run for, and it tells you what those values are down at the bottom. If you'll look, the history value changes how many years your world will run before World Gen will halt. The number of civilizations you'll have in your world, the number of sites, and so on and so forth. All of these settings can be changed in general terms. But they don't tell you necessarily what they're really doing behind the scenes. What does natural savagery mean? Oh my god. What does mineral occurrence really mean, and how much is everywhere and how much is very rare? There's no details on what that actually does. And frankly, I'm a control freak, so at the end of the day, we'll be designing our world through the Advanced Parameters menu. Now, Object Testing Arena is for people who want to tinker with the actual things that make Dwarf Fortress run. For example, if you want to perform combat testing and science on how the game plays, Object Testing Arena will allow you to create things out of thin air and put them to work, basically, having people fight one another, equipping them with armor, just random whatever comes to your mind. It's basically a giant gladiatorial arena where you can test objects and how they behave in the game. Yeah, technically possible to play without DFHack. Not recommended in my experience, but we'll do it tonight. Um, but I don't play without Therapist. I always wait for Therapist update. Frankly, navigating the game's labor menu if you plan to make any changes to what your dwarves can do is an exercise in carpal tunnel syndrome. So I don't generally bother with it. About DF, we'll tell you uh, who the game is created by, and Tarn Adams, aka Toady1, is responsible for Dwarf Fortress's coding in its entirety. Um, he's the guy that's responsible for the whole enchilada. We'll go into Design World with advanced parameters, and we'll go down to a small region. I haven't tested since Toady's changes to World Gen whether the larger worlds are still crashing. So we're going to stick to a smaller region tonight. We'll copy those settings, and you'll notice that Dwarf Fortress tells you what these keys are. We'll actually copy parameter set. Each one of these items in this list, and you'll notice I just copied the small region settings, is a parameter set. Each parameter set will create one type of world. Now, by default, these settings are pretty basic. They don't provide a lot of detail on differentiating your world. You'll get a very generic, albeit realistic world from these settings. Now what we're going to actually do is copy those settings off for small region, and we'll rename them. Small custom region. And we'll actually edit this. So I'll discuss what all of this means along the way, so you know what I'm changing, why I'm changing it, and how it's going to impact our game. So first off, I set these to use seeds, and then I'll just key in random stuff. In this case, I'm just going to leave it to say seed text. I'm not even going to change it. I'm just going to tell it yes. Seeds are what controls the world you get. Every world that's created has a parameter set and a seed or set of seeds that goes along with it. If I give you a copy of my parameter set and I give you a copy of my seeds, you can recreate the exact world that I recreate. So, for example, if I hit enter here and I type this in, and these are alphanumeric characters, that's the world gen seed that would affect our terrain creation. And if you enter that same seed and you have the same parameter set I do, you will get the exact same world that I do. So we'll be using that when we follow along. I'm going to actually just do the same thing with all of the other seeds. History seed determines the sorts of events you're going to see. We're going to set that one. Now, what you key in, capitals, lowercase, is important for export. Now, when we make changes in these parameter sets, what we're actually changing is an item in the world gen file that we discussed earlier. Oops, I want to save first before I do that. We'll come back in. Okay, now, if you actually open up the world gen file, now that I've saved it, down at the bottom, you're going to see small custom region, and there's the seed and the history seed. If you want to export or import a world, not necessarily as it exists currently, but the ability to recreate your world, these world gen entries are how you do it. So each one basically identifies one parameter set and its associated seeds, if any. So our custom one here, there's our seeds, seed text. There's the ones I entered that were numbers. So if you hit yes and you leave it as seed text, that's what you would get. So now if I edit these, I have to make sure I leave Dwarf Fortresses World Gen. If you're copying them in, make sure you don't copy them in the middle of another one. You skip to the end and drop it there, or skip to the beginning and drop it there. And make sure if you're copying one, you get all of the setting. So everything you need. Because if you get part of one, you're not actually importing the whole thing and it won't work. I don't want to make any changes there, so we'll come back out and we'll go back into the editing over here, and I'll do the same thing with all of the seeds. I'll just set them all from the digits from 1 to 0 on your keyboard if you're using an American keyboard. Alright, now embark points determines the quantity of resources that you get when you start out. When you settle on a site to actually start colonizing, embark points determines how much you can bring with you. If you want an easier game, turn it up. If you want a harder game, turn it down. You'll basically spend these. So if I want to bring food with me, I have to spend some embark points to do it. But how many you have and what you bring is sort of a balancing act for what you want to bring. And for an easy game, you could turn this up to something like 10,000, and you could bring the entire materials you needed to bring to build your fortress from scratch in the wagon, and you could basically just immediately start construction. We'll be leaving this at default, but if you need an easier game, or if you're just tinkering for whatever reason, changing your embark points will allow you to embark in that world and bring whatever you want with you. We'll leave the end year at default. Sometimes World Gen will stop early, and we'll discuss that in a sec. 1050 is as good a year as any. If you're running a shorter history, no, embark point setting is not new. It's been in since version 31, at least. Maybe before that, I don't know. You can actually change, how much you're bringing with you. If you're a new player and you just want to basically run a trial balloon fortress, you could, like I said, you could set it for 10,000 and basically bring all the materials you'd need to run a fortress from the get-go with you, without having to find them on site. We'll leave most of these settings here at default. End year will be determined the maximum year that World Gen will run. And as your history runs, events will occur, civilizations will rise and fall, events will occur, big beasts will lay siege to fortresses, and goblins will sack dwarven keeps. The history determines things that get engraved on your walls. It determines how many necromancers there are, how many goblins there are, how many elves there are, where everything is in the world. Cutting your fortress short can affect what's gone on. For example, in a previous fortress tutorial, we embarked in the year 35 at a particular site, and there's a necromancer fortress adjacent where you can be besieged by the undead. But that same world in the year 34 has no necromancer tower because it hasn't been founded yet. So, depending on what year you cut your fortress's history short to, you may or may not see certain things existing in your world. So, if you're wanting to see exactly the same world I'm getting, you're going to have to stop your fortress at the same place mine does. Population cap determines how many units there can be in your world after the civilizations are created. Site cap determines how many locations there are. Percentage beasts dead determines at what percentage of giant forgotten beasts the world will stop generating and start allowing you to play. So, for example, if the dwarven civilization rises to the top and begins going on a murderous rampage for all the forgotten beasts and killing them all off one at a time, when there's 80% left or dead, then my World Gen would stop because it wants to keep some of them for me. If you set this to 100, basically, you would only check if the beasts were dead when World Gen stopped. If you set it to -1, it never checks. Let's see. It'll begin checking the Mega Beast percentage in the year 100. I'm actually going to change that down to 10. If the Mega Beasts start dying off soon, I want to stop the World Gen a little earlier. We'll leave unimportant historical figures in and intact. Revealing all historical events determines whether all of history is available or whether only the parts that your dwarves know about is available, and whether things are visible to your adventurers and your dwarves from the get-go. This basically assumes that all your dwarves have history books, and all your history books are accurate. I'd leave this on yes. We won't touch it. I will tinker with these next few settings, and basically these are limits on the types of terrain you're going to get, and all of these affect the random generation of your terrain. In particular, I like to set the minimum elevation up a little bit, and let's discuss for a moment what that really means. This is a good time for us to talk in depth about the wiki. The Dwarf Fortress wiki is something I highly recommend for new players. It will basically allow you to uh, look up information. It's basically your encyclopedia Dwarf Fortress. It will tell you everything you ever wanted to know and then some about everything you could possibly want to know about playing Dwarf Fortress. How things work, how they interact, things to watch for. This can basically teach you the entire game. If you want to go out here and read for yourself, this is how I learned to play. I went out to the wiki and I looked up farming because I found out I needed to have my dwarves eat something, and I went out and looked at how to farm. We'll talk about that in our demonstration, but you can actually look up the article on farming. Now, some of the articles haven't been updated necessarily from the last version. They've been copied over, and so some things may be slightly different. But generally speaking, this is everything you would possibly want to know about farming and how to do it and what you need and the requirements and what that's used in and the whole 9 yards and how it interacts, complete with pictures. Now, one thing I want to touch on in particular is, I believe, the biome article. Biomes are the things that your world contains. Now, for those of you who haven't spent much time in a classroom of, elementary school science recently, forests, plains, deserts, oceans, mountains, the whole 9 yards, all of those are individual biomes. In particular, the information right down here at the bottom about how to generate a biome will allow you to control what sort of biomes you get. Now, you do want to retain a diversity of biomes, because if certain biomes aren't available, you can't actually embark in the world and play. And we'll tinker with this a little bit, but we'll modify some of these settings to control how much of various terrain we get. So first off, any terrain with an elevation between 0 and 99 is ocean. I want to make sure my oceans, if any, are small and kind of out of the way. So we'll limit our elevation in Dwarf Fortress. We'll set the minimum a little higher than the default of 1. We'll set it at about 4. Now remember, if we set this too high, say if we set it at 100, then we wouldn't actually get any oceans at all. Basically, the ground would be flat. There would be no wide open ocean spaces. I do want to allow the capacity for oceans. I just don't want to have more than a little bit of them. So we'll tinker that setting. I leave maximum elevation at the top, and the reason is because 400 is how you get mountain peaks, and without mountain peaks and high mountains, it's possible you don't get dwarves. So we want to leave the maximum elevation alone, because we want to make sure we have mountains for our dwarves to populate to begin with. X and Y variance determines how much they can change from one location to the next. So if we were at elevation 400 and we were proceeding east and west, X variance that's small would mean that there would be a very tiny little change from next one square to the next, to the next, the next, the next, and everything would be kind of flat, even if it had peaks. The details of your terrain would be buffed out. Y variance controls as you move up and down the map versus across the map for X variance. Minimum rainfall and temperature and drainage determines whether you're going to see frozen areas, whether you'll see deserts, whether you'll see clay and sedimentary soil, and so forth. We're going to deal with rainfall higher than this. On Earth, at least, every location gets at least some precipitation. So we'll set that to 1. Everything gets some precipitation. We'll set our temperature a little higher. This will kind of reduce some of the colder terrain at the north or south edge of the map. It'll minimize the size of our glaciers. You can't get rid of them unless you do something crazy like set the minimum higher than you need it. We won't mess with the variance as much. 100 basically means that, for example, if our temperature could vary by up to 100 units. 75 is a good maximum temperature. If you set this too high, it's possible that your world would generate with terrain that would melt your dwarves simply by existing. Drainage is whether you'll get clay and sand, and rainfall and drainage in particular interact over here, and we'll pop back over to the wiki for a second. So we've discussed that oceans, we need terrain between 300 and 400 to have mountains. We have to have mountains. If we don't have mountains, we don't have dwarves. If we don't have dwarves, we can't play Dwarf Fortress. So we want to make sure that we allow for this elevation to exist. And all other biomes lie in that gray range between 100 and 300. So drainage and rainfall then break down all of the other biomes that you care about that don't involve temperature specifically. So low rainfall and low drainage will get you a desert. Low rainfall and high drainage will get you badlands, and so forth. And this basically allows you to configure what sorts of terrain you'll see. Now notice that these ranges go from 0 to 100. That's assuming you use the default ranges. If we use a range from, say, 50 to 100, we'll only see things in this right-hand portion of the map. So we wouldn't see any savanna or grasslands. We wouldn't see deserts or badlands, because we don't have the terrain for that. We don't have the permission for them to exist. Now, we'll leave these pretty much across the board. By setting ours to 1, we've kind of cut down on the number of these we'll see slightly, but not enough to really worry about. If you set it to 10, however, you'd get none of these. They would basically be eliminated from the game. If I set drainage to 50 to 100, I would only get badlands, hills, and forests. I wouldn't see any swamps or deserts. This applies across the board. Now, temperature basically modifies some of these terrains into being different things. Glaciers form when the temperature gets really, really cold. Forests become taiga above that, at certain temperatures, and all other terrain becomes tundra. And temperature isn't something you can really tinker with because it's affected by latitude and elevation. Realistically, we modify it slightly, but I don't modify it a great deal. And the high end allows for those tropical biomes to exist. So we're kind of minimizing some of the cold end of things, but not greatly. We're not eliminating it. Okay. So drainage varies from 0 to 100, and our X and Y variants are 101, which basically means we could jump from perfect drainage to no drainage in one step across the map, basically. If you set the variances wide, you are increasing how diverse your embark will be. Or not your embark, your world will be. Yeah, this determines how many different terrains you can experience on the same map when you actually start playing. If you have a wide variance, for example, you could get mountains directly next to oceans. If you set your variance short, then you're going to get much more flattened gradual terrains, or much more flattened shifts between rainfall patterns, for example. Now, minimum savagery, I turn that up a little bit because I like a little rougher of an embark. Savagery determines how rough an area really is. Low savagery areas tend to be more benign creatures. Highly savage areas, you start getting animal men and giant versions of the animals. So, for example, in a relatively benign neutral terrain area, in terms of alignment, and we'll cover alignment momentarily, you might see wolves. In a really savage embark, they might be giant wolves or wolf men. So we'll allow for maximum savagery. We'll eliminate some of the lower savagery areas. We're allowing variance from top to bottom still. Now I set meshes, and we'll cover meshes in a second, but the first thing we'll do is go through and set all these to a small mesh, 2x2. And this controls the weighting of your terrain. So weighted range from 0 to 20 is the bottom 20% of whatever you set for your minimum and maximum. So right here, let's use drainage as an example because it's nice even round numbers, 0 to 100. If I go down to the drainage mesh size and I set this to 100, what I'm basically saying is I want the bottom 20%, in this case between 0 and 20, literally, I want the bottom 20% to be 100 times more common than all of these other terrain types, all of these other drainage types. So I would see low drainage almost across the board. There would still be some high drainage and some moderate drainage, but it would be minimal. There would be very, very little of it. So you want to be careful about setting these too wide. Now, what I typically will do is go through and set elevation very low at the low end, again, to kind of get rid of some of that ocean terrain. And I will kind of set this up a little bit across through the middle here. And then we'll have some at the high end for mountains. Okay? And what I'm saying is these three types that have 3 are all equally common, and each of them is 3 times as likely as the low end, and we won't see anything in this range. So this literally determines how common these elevations would be. For rain, I want to have, let's see, we'll do deserts. Whoops. We'll do deserts. And we'll eliminate the middle ranges between there and there, and we'll make those common. Now what this basically says is, for my rainfall range, which is 1 to 100, all of these are as likely, and so if I set these to 1 each, 1, none, 1, none, 1, they would be just as equivalent as if I set them to 10, none, 10, none, because they're all the same. If I set this one to 1, though, I'm affecting the commonality between these because it's all relative. Now, by setting our ranges this way, what I'm basically saying over here in the biome arc is I will have stuff in the bottom 20%, and I will have stuff in the middle 40 eliminated, so we won't see any savannas. They're gone. We've eliminated them. We'll see grasslands, but not savannas. And then I'll have the middle 40, which is entirely in this range here, so we'll get marshes, shrublands, and hills. And the upper range, which will contain, we'll miss out on some of the swamps, but we'll still get swamps and forests. And basically all I'm doing is setting up how common each of those terrain types will be. And I'm basically skewing the ratios of them. If you don't tinker with the Advanced World Gen, you're going to get these all set basically to whatever the default is, basically equivalent across the board, equal probabilities. Now, there's a further check a little further on down. Let's see, minimum mountain peaks. I don't worry too much about mountain peaks. I'll take at least one so we have some feature. I don't care about oceans, so I get rid of them. We'll turn up our minimum number of volcanoes. Volcanoes are nice for embarking on to get access to magma early. They're not essential, and we may not necessarily embark on one tonight, but setting the minimum number up a little bit allows us to make them more common in our world. Setting it too high can actually cause rejections. Setting any of these settings too broadly to an extreme will probably cause your world to reject, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But setting this up a little bit allows us to encourage volcanoes to exist on our map. Sometimes they'll be clustered, sometimes they'll be spread out. This doesn't determine anything about where they'll be. It just determines how many you'll see at a minimum. Mineral scarcity, I like to set this down a little bit, but not all the way to the bottom. If you set it too low, which means that there are minerals basically everywhere and crawling out of the woodwork, you can kind of get a situation where you won't see coal, or where flux may be eliminated because everything's a volcanic stone type setting, and you don't get the flux. You don't get the materials you need necessarily to make steel because you've set metals to be everywhere. So I kind of turn it down a little bit. Mesh size determines how frequently these sorts of things will change. So how big your brush is, if you will. Okay. We're going to tweak. Let's see, I didn't go through all this. So I want to see, I'll have some stuff at the low end. I don't care about this middle range, and I don't care about that middle range for savagery. So all of our savagery falls into bands. We have some at the low end, we have some at the middle, we have some at the high end. And what the mesh size is doing is determining how broad our brush is when we paint this on the map. So 2x2, 4x4, 8x8. Ignore basically means it drops our mesh. We don't paint with a brush that we weighted. So we'll set these to 2x2s and move on. Temperature, we'll set the same thing again. We're getting broad bands. There's not a gradual shift. We're going to have some at the low, some in the middle, and some at the high, and there'll basically be jumps between them. Typically speaking, I only care about extremes on most of these things. So for example, volcanism determines how common magma is and the types of stone you'll see on your map. And stone that I like to see is often called sedimentary stone because it contains iron and coal and so forth. And if you eliminate the low volcanism ranges, you won't see sedimentary stone, which means the only iron you'll get is the kind that appears around volcanoes, and you may not see coal at all because it requires sedimentary layers to exist. If you turn volcanism with the weighted range at the top all the way down, you're not going to get any volcanoes because there's not a sufficient volcanism to allow a volcano to exist. These minimums determine how many you're going to get of each thing. Megabeast Caves determines how many sites the Megabeasts have to live in. Titans determines how many of those there are when we're created. Population requirements and wealth requirements determine what the requirements are before a Titan will come to visit your fortress. All of these settings are tweakable, and most of them I leave at the defaults. I do tend to turn down the evil a little bit so that we get more neutral and good terrain on the map, and I basically have the amount of it. If we're looking for an evil embark, then I would want to leave this alone. But for tonight, we're not looking to embark in an evil terrain, and turning it down a little bit is just going to maximize the amount of area we can potentially embark in. Now, keep in mind, we've got these minimum finals here. So minimum initial determines how many squares of terrain must be mountains before your world will be permitted to exist. And it will basically throw the world out if it doesn't meet these minimums. So if I set the minimum final tundra count to 1, for example, and there was no tundra on my map, it would throw it out. I don't really care about tundra, so we'll turn it off. And most of these other settings, we're going to leave right where they are. We won't tinker them too much. I don't care about oceans, so typically I'll turn that to 0. You can't embark in an ocean. There's no practical interaction between dwarves and the ocean except fishing at this point, and you can fish in brooks, so there's no real need to have oceans around unless you just want to embark and potentially air drown whales or whatever. All right, so we've set our minimums for each of those. Erosion and river starts and surface terrain. Erosion cycles determines how eroded terrain will be. If you cut this down, your sites will tend to be craggier and less worn down. Minimum river starts determines how many river origin points there will be on your map, and you can turn this up if you want to have more rivers. Desired post-erosion determines this is how many you start with, and this is how many there are after you've done all your erosions. Extreme cliffs, for those of you who are wanting to know, are big shifts in elevation. Typically what will happen is if you've got a mountain next to a very low elevation biome, what would happen is that extreme cliff between the really tall mountain and the really low point would get eroded, flattened out a little bit, so that it was a little more gradual. Orographic precipitation and rain shadows. This is actually a meteorological phenomenon caused when clouds move over mountains. Basically, they leave their water on one side of the mountain, and the other side tends to be drier. So you'll get a more realistic, a more plausible precipitation pattern if you leave this on. So that gives you an idea of the kind of depth and detail that goes into the mechanics behind all of this. Maximum number of subregions is a limit on how varied a world can be. 5,000 is the maximum. I really don't care if my world looks like a completely unrealistic patchwork quilt. So I turn that all the way up. If it looks like that, I don't care. I'm embarking on and building a fortress in one location. I'm not actually going to be seeing the world. If you're playing in an adventurer mode and you want to embark, you want to adventure across a world that's crazy varied, then turning that up will allow you to do it. If you turn it back down or leave it at default, you're going to see a little more flattened shift in biomes, for example. Subregions are determined by the types of terrain that there are, so a forest will be named differently than the mountains next to it, for example. And if you have settings that allow your variance to be very high, and you leave this down, it'll basically toss the world out because you have too many subregions. So if I allow my world to vary hugely, but I don't turn this up, it's possible I'll get worlds that are thrown out simply because they're too varied. Cavern layer determines how many caves there are. Openness, minimum, maximum, and passage density, minimum and maximum, are used to set the terrain of your caverns. So there are 3 caves between the surface and the bottom of the world, and each of them has an openness and passage density that's determined, and I typically set these to 0 each one. And basically what this will do is it will give us very large vaulted caverns. They'll be open, kind of like if you took big pockets of surface space and walled them in with stone. That's going to be what our passages will look like. If you set the openness to something a little more in the middle, and you turn the passage density all the way up, you can get these very tight labyrinthian corridors that twist and wind on themselves. If you're planning to play Dwarf Fortress in adventure mode at some point and roam around the world as an adventurer, setting these to these kinds of settings will allow you to have broad open caverns that are harder to get lost in. Minimum and maximum, I like to turn water minimum up to 1. That prevents dry caves, basically. Setting this at 0 can mean that certain features can be missing from caves. Mud and plant growth can be missing from a cave. All my caves have it if I turn this up. That prevents us from basically hitting a dry cave, and we'll talk about what that really means once we actually get to the point where we're playing in the caverns. Magma layer and bottom layer, I would turn those on. Z levels, and basically this determines how deep your world is required to be in terms of floors. Now, this requires a bit of visualization, so bear with me here for a second. If you imagine the world as being a series of layers from the top of the sky down to the surface, all the way down through the stone to the very core of the world, a series of stacked layers, each Z level, which is what those layers are called, is its own floor, basically. So if you imagine the entire world divided up into floors like an elevator that you can go up and down in, the Z levels are how many of those there are required to be. Z levels above the ground are required if you wanted to build a tower. So for example, if I wanted to build a 50-story tower above the ground, I would have, by these settings, 15 Z levels from the tallest point on my map up to the surface, the top of the sky. So if I wanted to build a 50-story tower, I'd have to turn this up, or I would actually run out of space, basically. My tower would grow up to level 15, and then I wouldn't be able to go any higher because there's no higher to go. Typically, I'll turn this up a little, but not too much. Unless I'm planning to build something very tall, there's no real point to having it up. And more space in your embark will cut into your frame rate. This is more space for birds to fly around in, for example. 30 actually allows them to fly out of reach, so maybe we'll turn that down to 20 for right now. Z levels above layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are general chunks of the world. Above layer 1 is the space between the surface and the first cave. Z level 2, or above 2, is the space between the bottom of the first cave and the start of the second cave. 3 is between 2 and 3. 4 is below the bottom cave all the way down to the bottom of the world. 5 is how much magma there is at the bottom. And Z levels at the bottom is an area that we'll touch on much, much later. Minimum natural cave size and maximum natural cave size determine how big those caves can be tall. So I'll typically set that to 1, and I'll typically set this down to something a little smaller. If you set that at 5 and 25, what that basically means is your caves are at least 5 stories from their tallest point to their lowest point. And if you set it the maximum to 25, that means the biggest, tallest caves are no more than 25 from the top to the bottom. Mountain caves are caves that things like kobolds and other sites will live in. Non-mountain caves, same thing. I typically leave these at default. I make caves visible because I don't want to try and embark and find out that I've just embarked my 7 dwarves right on a dragon's lair, for example. If you want to have the real Dwarf Fortress experience, leave that off. But for my purposes, it just makes it easier to find an embark we can embark in. I show tunnels. We won't touch the number of civilizations. We will require a playable civilization. If you turn this off, it's possible to have a world that eliminates dwarves, and once the dwarves are eliminated, you can't actually play Dwarf Fortress in Dwarf Fortress mode without having a playable civilization. So this will allow us to ensure that we have a dwarven civilization to embark as. Now, minimum number. These guys right here, the minimum numbers at the very bottom of the World Gen file, are basically the most common thing that you're probably going to have go wrong with your World Gen and cause a rejection. Remember, we changed the weighted meshes and we changed the settings on how much of some things you'd see. For example, we might have minimized savagery or changed the weighting of these things. In particular, let me page down here back through to those. Savagery we set all the way at the top, all the way in the middle, and then all the way at the bottom. And these are equal. So we have the full range of savagery in broad bands. And you'll notice that basically all of the bands, the topmost 30%, the middle 30%, and the bottom 30%, all have some terrain permitted. Now that will allow us to, when I get to the bottom down here at these minimums, mid-elevation, low elevation, high elevation, just exactly what it sounds like. Oh, discipline. Yeah, that's a new feature. I found out about that the other day. Yuck. If we set one of these too high, if I set minimum elevation to, or mid-elevation to 5,000, for example, or turns out the maximum was 4,225, and we didn't have at least that minimum number of squares, minimum elevation, it would throw my world out. Now, the problem is I've set this so high that this would basically throw out every world. So basically it would toss our, we'd toss out our worlds over and over again, and we'd never actually create one. Now, I don't like the weighting of these. I don't mind leaving them a little more broad. So we'll actually set these across the board equivalent so that the mid is equivalent to both the low and the high. So I don't care that we have more terrain in the middle, the more moderate terrains. I just want to have at least a small number of everything. So all I'm doing is setting all of the mids equivalent to the low and the high for their category. This, generally speaking, broadens the types of worlds that my World Gen will allow or permit. So now we've got our seeds. We've set all of our configuration settings for how our world will get created. And we'll bounce out of there, and we got to remember to save our settings. If you try to actually do it, it will warn you, but we'll hit F6 and save. So now our custom region settings are configured and set up. Now we'll hit enter, and we'll start creating worlds. And notice it tosses worlds out, tries to generate a few things. There we go. We got a world accepted, and it's now moved into history phase. Basically, World Gen actually creates a world, just like you would imagine. Now, we're only going to run a relatively short World Gen, because I'm not sure all of the long history crashes have been worked out, so we'll run about 150 years and stop, and I'll abort it manually. But basically, all of those things that you saw there, preparing elevation, running the rivers, growing the vegetation, recounting the legends, are steps in creating the world we'll embark in. Let me check the volume on SoundSense here just a sec. Whew, SoundSense is a little loud today. Okay, so basically this is creating, you can see over here, pictures of all the terrain in our world. So this is our world over here on the right. This is some evil terrain. This is a good mountains terrain. This is an evil forest and grasslands area. This is a desert. These are hills, and so on and so forth. These are settlements of dwarves. These are settlements of goblins, and so on. Here are some volcanoes, glacier space down here at the bottom. And we'll be able to pick where we want to embark. Now, before we actually start our map, what I want to talk about is how to export the settings from your map so that everybody can generate the same maps and pass them along. So I aborted our world gen at the year 152. We'll use the world as it exists. And before we do anything else, I'll hit P to export our image and info. Now what that actually does is out in the Dwarf Fortress folder, it creates these three files: Region 1 World Gen Parameters, Region 1 World History, Region 1 Sites and Populations. And the World Gen parameters are exactly what you would need to copy or send to someone if you wanted to hand them an exact copy of your world. So if you copy my World Gen exactly as I have it here and you paste it into your World Gen file and use that same set of settings, you will get exactly the same world I do. World history details the things that have gone on in our world before we actually start play. So these are the races and their kings and queens and their history all through all of them. The Realm of Deer is a group of humans. They have a deity that is the wickedness of sin, who represents lust and depravity. Their lawgiver was this person who began the reign and died in the year 58. And this person ran in the year 58 and then died in the year 126. And this person replaced them in the year 76, and so on. This basically is all the history of all your civilizations. And as your world generates and runs longer, this list gets longer and longer and longer. So up at the top here are the uncivilized races, and then the dwarves, if you have any dwarves left. Humans, goblins, kobolds, elves, and so on. The sites and populations lists all the cities and the populations of your world. This is how many humans, elves, goblins, kobolds, and dwarves there are in your world, right there. These are the sites, the locations in your world, and what they are. So there's a forest retreat somewhere in our world called Woodheated, Avathasa in the Elven language. And who owns it, the parent civilization that basically controls it. How many elves, humans, ravens, wolves, chipmunks, hamsters, echidnas, and dingoes are represented in that civilization. And you could look at any world civilization you liked and find them. Okay, but we've created our world, and when we hit enter, it will be saved. We'll discuss where that goes here momentarily, so bounce back out. In the data folder is a save folder. And once DF actually finishes saving here, alright, so now it's saved our world. You'll notice Start Playing now appears because we've actually created a world in which to play. And Region 1 is the save folder that contains our first region. Now basically these region folders are basically your save data and the raw files that were used to create that save data. So here are specific RAWs for my world. And these are the same as they were when that game was created. So those general raw files we showed at the beginning, if you make a change to those and then you create a world, that world was created with those raws, and changing them after the fact can have undesirable consequences. It can basically break your save game. So unless you know what you're doing, don't tinker. If you want to change something, however, like for example your graphics after the fact, then you need to make sure that you update your save games accordingly. These files contain the actual save data. Deleting, removing, or altering any of them could cause undesirable results. Don't do it. Current is the world currently loaded. Region is which region you have. And you could have 10, 15 regions. I don't know what the maximum is. I've never had more than, I don't know, 8 or 9. Copy them off, save them off, delete them, replace them, and so forth. Now, as our world gets played a little bit, we'll end up with multiple Region 1 folders because I have backup saves on. So we'll get a Region 1 Spring, a Region 1 Summer, a Region 1 Winter, a Region 1 Spring, Second Year, and so on. We'll get saves that basically stack up and allow us to revisit any point in the fortress's history if we like. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Now that you've created a world, we can start playing. There are 2 modes we won't really talk about too much. Adventurer mode allows you, the player, to control one particular dwarf or one particular human and go out on adventures in the worlds you've created. Fight those legendary beasts, pillage those goblin cities, steal, murder, become a necromancer or a vampire or a werebeast, and so forth. Legends mode is a mode that will basically allow you to revisit the history of your world and all of the information that goes into it. So those things that we exported, for example, these are all the historical figures and when they died or were born throughout World Gen history. So this is every elf, goblin, human, forgotten beast, necromancer, you name it. They're all here. When they were born, when they died, what they did. So here's a female human, Shud something or other, and she was a human. She was the eldest daughter of these 2 guys in the early spring of something. This dwarf killed her, basically. So at some point, the dwarves were at war with this group, or this person went out adventuring, and ooh, look, the dwarf actually ate her. There you go. So this dwarf actually ate that human. Related historical figures and the civilizations that this person was part of. Adventure mode is a true roguelike in all senses of the word. If you are playing adventure mode, death is swift, sudden, and without remorse. Doesn't take a mistake on your part. You can play completely perfectly, and the random number generator can basically screw you. You could take a random arrow to the head, basically, and unlike Skyrim's arrow to the knee, you're not going to retire and become a guard, you're just dead. Legends mode also lists all of the locations, rare artifacts, the regions. So these are, if you'll see on the right, there's kind of a thumbnail view of our map, our entire world, and these are the different regions that make that world up, and there are a number of them. The history of within that region, for example. So there was a giant dingo at some point that got ambushed repeatedly over and over again. The giant dingo here fought the giant dingo. The latter escaped unscathed, so the giant dingo keeps getting away. Underground regions are exactly what you'd expect. Civilizations and other entities are what you'd expect. If these are, you'll notice how there are more historical figures than are actually available. There's certain things are hidden from you. Historical maps of the world. Enter will toggle the territories and so forth and allow you to kind of see what you're looking at. You can go through that all the time, change the year as the world progresses and so forth. This is this thing that says Age of Myth might say something different in yours if you ran to a different length of World Gen. And this is literally every event that ever was ever in the history of ever in your world. So, for example, the duel of the husband of the Shadow Hag Speakcut Sneak Pages and the human vampire Zekdu Clear Nurtures occurred. And so there was actually a duel that was fought at that point in history at that time. So we'll run that event all the way up to the top. We'll actually see if we can't find the outcome of that duel here. So there's the duel. And in the early autumn, the Shadow Hag attacked the vampire, and the vampire got away, basically. He fled. So there's the history. So there was a Shadow Hag that abducted a person and fought a vampire, and the vampire got away. There you go. One historical event in the entirety of our world. Now, what we really are here for, however, is Dwarf Fortress. So that's where we'll start today. The world will actually advance 14 days from the start of the year, and then it will allow you to start picking a location. Now, there's a lot of information to digest here when we're picking an Embark site, so kind of bear with me and I'll run through it all. Tab will cycle you through various screens that give you various information about the area you're embarking in. And these three map pictures basically represent a larger or smaller view of the world. So this is the entire world. This region corresponds to that location on the X. So you can kind of see up here is the evil terrain. There's the evil terrain smaller. So this is a more zoomed out view. And likewise, this X here corresponds to this entire local area. And inside that local area is the area in which we would embark. So now we're going to move that embark square around and kind of look for a spot to site our fortress on. So now we've got where do we want to embark? And this is the Phoebus tile set, so those of you who are playing with the raw ASCII version, yours is going to look entirely different than mine. My apologies for those of you who like watching the ASCII version. I find it hard. It really annoys me. I shuffle the characters around in my head and have difficulty following the action. So I've become accustomed to actually playing with a graphics tile set. In my tile set, that eye right there is actually a tower. You can see it right here. We'll move our embark square down, although we can't embark on that tower. This is the tower right here. We could open up Legends mode and look at that tower and find its history, when it was founded, how many zombies are in it, the whole 9 yards. Basically, what you need to know for that purpose is that a tower adjacent to your embark will have you visited by necromancers and the undead. You'll be besieged by them. Likewise, if I go over here and I embark near goblin civilizations, I would expect to see goblins visiting my site, and so forth. If I embark near humans, I'm going to see humans, and so forth. So here's an elven civilization and a human civilization, a necromancer tower here and here, evil terrain with nobody living in it, some dwarves settled in this area up here, dwarves here. Now, this area where our embark square is a combination of two biomes. One is this one was here, and the other is that little square there. And F1, F2, F3, F however many you have, will switch between all of the biomes. So F1, and it'll flash the terrain that corresponds to, is the biome that takes up that space, basically. And it's a sand desert with warm temperatures, no trees or other vegetation, in relatively calm surroundings. Now, basically, there's 9 types of surroundings. Calm is the low savagery neutral version. So they basically exist on an axis between savage and good and evil. And in the surroundings article, we'll see what those are. So here's calm. This is the area we're pointed at right here. It's relatively low savagery and it's neutral. And the wiki talks about what those mean, but basically in good terrain you'll see certain types of fairy creatures that you won't see elsewhere, like unicorns. And in evil terrain the dead will walk and your butchered corpses will come back to life, and skeletons and zombies will be everywhere. Evil terrain is much, 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 much more difficult than the other 2 types. Good terrain is not, strictly speaking, easier than neutral. It just means that it's a little more happy, if you will. Unicorns, for example, are just as lethal as other types of animals. They have a tendency to skewer dwarves. Contrary to popular belief, unicorns are not evil, but as often as they can kill dwarves, you might kind of think they are. As savagery increases, you'll move up into giant animals and animal men. And if you move into evil, you'll start seeing undead. So a terrifying embark is a high savage, high evil embark. And a terrifying glacier, for example, would probably be among the more difficult embarks that one could attempt, simply by virtue of having all of your dead things come back to life, and a paucity, a scarcity of uh, resources because the glacier is not going to have wood to cut. It may not have metals, for example. All right, so we'll go back over here. Now, if we switch to the other biome, F2, you'll see these settings kind of change. So F2 is a temperate ocean. So this area here is two biomes, and this would be this entire square, where this middle area is a treeless desert, and it's immediately adjacent to ocean. So on our embark, if we embarked here, we would see a sort of C-shaped desert wrapped around a tiny little fingerlet of ocean. And that would kind of determine what we would see. Now, depending on where we embark, as I move across the map here, let's go down over here towards this dwarven civilization, and over here at the bottom, there's tundra, and here are some mountains. And where you embark will have an impact on a few things. In particular, as I tab through these screens, if I embark here, I'm only going to see dwarves, humans, and elves and my nearest neighbors. The only dwarven civilization available to me is the Superior Paints. If I keep tabbing, you're going to get a relative elevation scale that will determine how high or low elevations are on your particular map. And as I move the embark square around, you can kind of see that I'm saying, hey, I want to have, if I embark here, everything's kind of going to be at the same height. And this is basically a topographic map of the area in which you're embarking. Yeah, I'm going to try to post this out to YouTube. I'm really terrible about remembering to come back and edit my Twitch videos before they get purged and push them off to YouTube, and I really need to remember to do it for this. Keep in mind, we're going to have to go back and revisit the tutorial for version 40 anyway when DF Hack comes out, so and as the features continue to stabilize and appear, performance enhancements and so forth. So we'll be back doing the tutorial again later, but this is a good version to start with. In addition to elevation, there's also cliffiness. The cliff indicator determines how steep the cliffs are in your area. So 0 is pretty much a perfectly flat area. 1 is a very, very, very shallow hill, maybe a tiny little slope that goes up once across the entirety of your map, for example. Stuff that has a star of some sort in my tile set is a really, really steep peak, maybe even a vertical face. So you'll get cliffs that shift in elevation dramatically. Now, where that'll come into play is, say, for example, I was going to embark over here at the edge of these mountains. Let's go down here and see where. So here we are at the very foothills of the mountains. If I move this terrain down, you can kind of see we've got forest surrounding a kind of inlet of mountains here. And there's two different biomes there. And if I tab over to the elevation screen, you kind of get an idea that there's a higher elevation here than there is in this area over here. And as I keep tabbing, there's peaks basically that will rise up into this center area of our map here. So this is going to be a higher elevation here at this point on this mountain here than there is in the top right corner. This kind of gives you an idea of the setting into which you will embark, and picking a setting will determine what sort of resources you have available to you when you play, and we'll kind of get an idea for how your game is actually going to go from the get-go before you've even started. Embarking in a glacier is going to minimize how much wood you can cut, and will make it difficult for your dwarves to harvest resources that they might want on the surface, such as edible plants. The stone and soil indicators down here at the bottom will determine what sort of metals are available to you. Now, it doesn't tell you specifically whether you have iron or whether you have copper or silver or gold, but generally speaking, for a player, you're going to want to look for plural, shallow and deep metals, not singular, metals, and ideally something with flux. Soil, you'll want to make sure you at least have some, and we'll get into why that is here once we embark. But let's look for a spot here. Let's get a spot that's got goblins as a neighbor. There we go. This is somewhere in this area would be pretty good. How far over can we go here and still see goblins as a neighbor? I'm kind of get away from some of these other civilizations if I can. Just because, not for any particular reason. So this is fairly flat terrain here. Let's see. What happens if I go down over here? Can we get a volcano? And that'll give us a tower. That's not quite where I want to embark for a tutorial map. towers would mean I'd be besieged by necromancers, and that's a little more advanced subject than I really want to cover in our tutorials here. So let's see. That's giving us shrubland, cold, high savagery, clay. We may or may not have sand, but we have clay, multiple metals, flux, and how many biomes do we have? There are 3 biomes here, a shrubland, a savanna, and we get fairly deep soil, but it's kind of cold here and there's not a lot of trees, and I do want to embark someplace with some trees. See if we can find ourselves a forest. It's not right adjacent to the necromancer. Ooh, a swamp. Why not? You'll notice that swamps are heavily forested and thick, for example, meaning that there are lots of other edible plants and that there's a great deal of trees. Trees will go very thickly on the map. Oh yeah, volcano and near tower is volcano makes your map easier, believe it or not. Easy access to magma means you can easily get into the metalworking very quickly without having to dig down to the bottom of the world to find magma for forging. If you don't have a volcano, you either have to dig all the way to the bottom or you have to rely on coal or wood burning. I like having a swamp. One of the things I am going to make sure we have is a stream or brook. So let's see, what are we looking at in elevation? So this is going to be a perfectly flat map that is completely swamp. There's only one biome, there's not multiple here. It's all freshwater swamp. It's going to be fairly cold. It's going to be relatively benign. The stream that runs along the southern edge of our embark is called the Nasty Ankle. Deep soil means that we will have 3 layers of soil before we hit stone. Yeah, I don't need to embark in heavily forested, but I do want to talk about how that impacts you. And for a new player, heavily forested is a little simpler than. Actually, in this case, I take it back. They re-enabled dwarf, or they re-enabled the elven diplomat, didn't they? I don't want to embark in a heavily forested area because then I'm going to cut down all the trees and the elves will go to war, and I don't want to mess with them in a tutorial, so that's got to go. We don't want to be quite that heavily forested. Sparse woodland. Woodland is good. Oh, but that's evil. I don't want evil. Sparse. Let's see here. The Nasty Ankle, yeah. The names are often a little silly, but that's okay. It's all good. Sparse. I want a little more trees than that. I do want to have some. That'll do. All right. Oops. Don't want a bigger embark. I want to move the embark rectangle. There we go. And we'll move it over just a hair here. I think that gets us just maybe a peak in the northeastern corner, but it won't be very tall. It'll just be a slow hill. Oh, but there's no metals there, so that's not going to work. Okay, let's try the Site Finder. So the Site Finder allows us to automatically search for a particular area. Let's look for something with low savagery, medium evil. I don't care about elevation, temperature, rain, drainage. I do want flux. I don't care about an aquifer. We do want a river. We want multiple shallow and deep metals. We want soil. Let's look for deep soil if we can, and let's see if we can't find some clay while we're at it. Now this is a fairly specific. Yeah, the trees are regrowing super fast, but that may not be true in future versions. And although the amount of wood has been cranked up, okay, that's true. You always want to make an underground forest farm, and we will. But we may also want to cut lots of trees to go to war with the elves. So we'll use the Site Finder to see what we can find. So now the Site Finder will basically run through our world, checking areas of the map for the particulars that we looked for. As you can see, it highlights some of these areas in these little green crosses. Those areas meet all of our requirements. So we'll have deep soil and multiple metals and so forth. And I see in the region map, oh, that's adjacent to the tower though. I'm trying to avoid the tower. See if I can't get the desert alongside something else with some trees. That'd give us both the area to embark in and a little bit of wood. That'd be kind of nice. But all of this is heavy forested in here. Yeah, it looks like it is. Site Finder obviously isn't working entirely correctly, or else there's something in here that allows for multiple metals. There it is. So there's an area that would allow multiple metals. And that's reasonably moderate in terms of the wood area. Not too cliffy. Cliffiness means that I'd have to deal with a very vertical cliff face on the front of my fortress. And yeah, undead are much nastier in this version than they were before. Armor and weapons are bad. The elves aren't quite as bad because they use wooden weapons, which are fairly weak, but I'm generally speaking wanting to avoid going to war with the elves because I like importing rare animals like giant scorpions to defend my fortress. I'd love. That's why that appeared, because there's just a tiny little area in this corner that has the particular settings I wanted. That's fairly flat. It's got a stream that's going to be fairly close to where we embark. This is a pretty good site. We'll use this. So we're going to embark. Let's see, where's our world rectangle here? We're right here in the world map. We're right here in the region map, just northeast of this little site here. We're kind of embarking a little close to the goblins, but that's okay. We're embarked in the bottom left-hand corner of that tile. And it'll have metals of multiple types at different layers within the soil. We'll have 3 layers of soil. We'll have flux, plenty of trees. Wilderness is a moderate savagery, moderate evil. So this is a neutral, moderate savagery environment. Other vegetation is moderate, so we'll have some edible plants, but not an overabundance. We will probably have to deal with cutting back the trees to keep them from collapsing on our fortress. Shrubland is kind of like lightly wooded, very lightly wooded terrain, mostly bushes with some trees. Yeah, we discussed biomes. I specifically pulled up the wiki article on biomes. So, for example, broadleaf forest. Let's talk a little more in depth about one in particular. So, forests. What biome you get controls what sort of wildlife you'll see. So, if I had an evil temperate broadleaf forest, I would get phantom spiders. If I have a savage temperate broadleaf forest, I get fox squirrels, and so forth. Controlling your world gen and picking an embark will determine what sorts of things you have to encounter. And so, yeah, we talked about F1, F2 to switch between the biomes. So this is tropical. This is temperate shrublands here with multiple, and then in that area there's only deep metals. There are no shallow metals. So for our metals, we're going to be around the edge of the map if I embark at this spot. Well, rats. That's not going to work. Oh, wait, there's a spot there, right in the middle of that. Oh, but I bet that's too close to the tower. Darn it. Let's see. Can't get trees if I do that. I bet that's Rocky Wasteland over that way, isn't it? Yep, Rocky Wasteland. Surfeit of the particulars I wanted. Well, let's change it then. Let's go back to let's go back to the finder and tell it I don't need deep soil. I only need a little soil. I need one soil layer. See if maybe that broadens our selection a little bit. And it may not because our settings are fairly close to what we had before. Doesn't look like it. So we'll go ahead and take that embark that we were going to take before. And we'll have to remember that if we want metal, we're going to have to look around the northwest and southeastern edges of our map. Now, what I can do is I can push this up a little bit, and that'll kind of put us a little further away from the water. But what it will also do is give us a little more of the metals that we're looking for. So the northeastern area of our map will have no shallow metals, basically. But when we embark, we'll land in the center of whatever terrain area we get. So we'll be embarked in an area that's got plenty of metal. We'll be able to connect it to the river if we need to get water. This is a good spot. We'll use this. Now, you can change the size of your region that you embark in. Ours is 4x4. If you get larger than about 5x5, you're probably asking for trouble. If you can actually embark on an entire 16x16 local map and get the game to load and actually play worth a hoot, you should probably let me know so that I too can get access to that NSA supercomputer. But since most people are going to embark in areas that don't either lock up or crash when they try to embark in them, you're probably going to embark in a 5x5 or smaller space. We'll be using a 4x4 tonight. I'll hit embark. That's E. It comes up and gives me a nice warning and says, hey, are you really sure? Because once we do this, we can't take it back. Yeah, okay. We'll prepare for the journey carefully. These settings here come with the starter pack, and they basically are predefined sets of skills and items that we'll bring with us. We'll prepare for the journey carefully. And what that basically means is we're going to pick out everything we bring with us. We'll be able to set up everything we have that we're going to take. Now, what we see here when we first pick this is we actually are given a list of our 7 dwarves that we'll embark with and their skills. And right now, none of our dwarves have any skills whatsoever. They're basically all blank templates. And if I hit tab, I'll go over to the items we're bringing with us. Now, the first thing I do when I'm embarking carefully and I'm setting up a profile from the start is I get rid of absolutely everything the default profile gives me. I don't take any of it. All of it, goodbye. All of it, gone. Psh, done. Then I go back over to skills. Now, I rush to add right now before we get underway that the skills I'm going to take are not necessarily optimized. They are things that I have found that work well for me, and you are encouraged to experiment with them later on in your own embarks. However, I will explain why I'm taking what I'm doing because I find that it applies generally. So in particular, I'm going to have 4 miners. We'll increase each of those to competent, which is 3 skill levels of mining. Now, miners will gain skill fairly quickly early on as they actually do mine, so it's not necessary to really give them all the skill, and at the same time, giving them some skill allows them to cut through the stone a little more quickly. The reason I take 4 as opposed to just say 1 is that I really want to make sure I have a space